and AM 630.
I take executive action only when we have a serious problem, a serious issue, and Congress chooses to do nothing.
Well, that's absolutely reasonable, isn't it? Who could argue with that logic? Well, Professor William Jacobson, he the proprietor of LegalInsurrection.com, a must-read blog every day. He takes issue with it, only in that it's not constitutional. This is the case he made yesterday in a USA Today column titled, "The Constitution's Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Year." Professor Jacobson, thanks for joining us here in studio. Why was it such a bad year for our Constitution?
Well, look how it started, look how it ended. We started the year with executive action, unilateral action on immigration. Last year, the so-called Mini Dream Act, and we're ending it on an even bigger immigration unilateral action, which is legalizing close to 5 million people who are in the country illegally without going to Congress to get the okay to do that. And it's even more than just legalizing people who are here illegally. It's the way he's going about it. He's issuing he's essentially just implementing a policy that he wants, which creates a new group of people, a new status that doesn't exist under the immigration laws, who are essentially exempt from deportation.
So, Professor, when this is raised, as Fox News White House correspondent Ed Henry raised it with Josh Ernest, the spokesman, the White House through Josh Ernest, but also the president himself, he usually says the same thing. Here's the response.
Whether it's taking action on climate change, adding some accountability to our broken immigration system, or even relaxing some of the failed trade restriction policies as it relates to Cuba, the president has taken a number of steps using his executive authority to move the country forward. And I recognize that this was something that was done over the objection of many members of Congress. But frankly, a lot of this was done because Congress was refusing to act.
What's wrong with that argument? These are problems. Everyone knows that these are problems, and the president, the Congress isn't doing anything, so the president must.
Well, that's not the way our system is set up. We're set up with checks and balances, and that's how the framers set it up. And in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, they vested all legislative powers in the Congress. They never said that the president gets to be the master legislator just because he doesn't like Congress. And that's essentially the problem that we have here.
All right, and listen, we talk about this a lot here, and just following us, we'll hear from the great one, Mark Levin, for 3 hours, and you know that Mark Levin talks about this quite a bit on the air. But here's the question. Whenever you're dealing with an adversary, either a political adversary or you're negotiating with somebody, there has to be an or else. There has to be a threat looming over their head so that they don't go beyond what they're allowed to do. What's the or else here? What can be done in response?
Well, that's the big problem here, that the president has found sort of a gap in our system, and that gap in our system is executive discretion, prosecutorial discretion, that the Congress can only pass laws, but it can't implement them itself. But the courts will give great deference to the executive branch in how to implement the law. So he's using that as an excuse not to really implement the law, but to create new legislation that doesn't exist.
But he's calling it prosecutorial discretion.
Well, but it's really not. Whether a court will get involved is the big question. It's not prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutorial discretion, if you want to use a traffic analogy, would be we have too many people speeding. We can't pull them all over, so we're only going to pull over people who are speeding 20 miles over the speed limit.
That's not to suggest that people going 10 miles over aren't breaking the law, but...
Exactly, and what he has done is he has said we're not going to distinguish among speeders. We're going to give a certain group of people, based on their characteristics, an exemption from the speeding laws.
Right.
That's very different than prosecutorial discretion.
If you have any questions for Professor Jacobson, or if you would like to talk to him and maybe get his advice on what you can do with regard to your political activity in light of the assault on the Constitution that many of us see is happening from the executive branch, give us a call, 888-630-9625. Listen, Legal Insurrection blog writes about everything in the news, but you certainly specialize in issues that affect the law and affect, the Attorney General at the constitutional level as well. So he can field any questions you've got or any comments that you've got. Jump on in here, 888-630-WMAL. Let's talk about Legal Insurrection for a minute, and I want everyone to get to know you, Professor Jacobson. You are a Cornell law professor. you certainly seem to lean to the right. It's funny, anybody who's a constitutionalist and wants to preserve the original intent and meaning of our founders is now considered to be a conservative, but I guess you would fall into that department, given the content of your website. How did that happen? Most Cornell law, I'm thinking that you have a very small meeting room there with all the conservative right-leaning law professors at Cornell.
That's right. It's me, myself, and I in the room.
You've needed a phone booth, if they still have phone booths.
That's right. It really started by chance. In 2008, I just got very frustrated with the media bias and the media's coverage of the election cycle, and I was feeling very frustrated, and the word insurrection came to mind.
Yes.
And then I looked it up, and an insurrection by definition is illegal, so I said, that's probably not a good thing to call the website, so I said, let's call it Legal Insurrection.
Yeah.
So it started just before the election in 2008. We've grown tremendously. We have several people who write for us. We have a great team, and we cover politics and law, and as we're discussing today, that intersection of politics and law, I think you probably could characterize us as a conservative/Tea Party perspective, smaller government.
But again, out of Cornell?
Out of Cornell, that's right. I don't know what happened, and neither do they.
Well, listen, I want you to know, I don't know, we've talked before, but did you ever actually meet Andrew Breitbart face-to-face? Did you ever get a chance to meet him?
I only got a call from him
But
once.
You need to know that he was a huge fan of your site and was quite jealous that you were able to corner the market on what you did there at Legal Insurrection. I'm sure had he lived longer, he would have gobbled you up and you would have been part of the whole system there, Breitbart. All right, taking your calls on this and more to discuss with Professor William Jacobson of legalinsurrection.com.
Continues on 105.9 FM and AM 630 WMAL.
I can use that pen to sign executive orders and take executive actions and administrative actions that move the ball forward.
Yep, the pen and the phone. That was one of the audio cuts that really angered people this year. Listen, is it Fast and Furious? Is it immigration? Is it the Fast and Furious scandal? Is it the immigration moves that we just mentioned? What is it that you have been angered about from this president acting unilaterally and outside of the confines of Congress that has fired you up? 888-630-9625. And also, what about the Supreme Court and their actions with regard to Obamacare? I know that you were very outspoken about the decision that was made in 2012, but now we've got another case coming up. And in light of Mr. Gruber's comments from MIT, where do you think Obamacare is going to end up?
Well, this could be a very interesting year. The Supreme Court accepted a case involving whether subsidies to purchase Obamacare were available on the federal market as opposed to the state exchanges, I should say federal exchange. And the law seems to be pretty clear, although some courts have ruled the other way, that you only get those subsidies if you are purchased on a state exchange.
On a state exchange. And, of course, the Supreme Court decision that sort of validated much of Obamacare, they did allow states to opt in or out of those state exchanges.
And most states have opted out of those state exchanges. So most of the people purchasing Obamacare through an exchange are purchasing it on the federal exchange. The only way people can afford it is with the subsidy. I mean, that's the great hoax here in a sense. It's only affordable if the federal government subsidizes it.
With our money.
With our money. But the law says you only get that subsidy if you purchase on a state exchange. Two appeals courts have ruled that is not true, that you can get it even on the federal exchange. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court accepted the case, which says that at least 4 of those justices think there's a problem here with that interpretation.
If you had to predict, and again, I want to bring Gruber back into the mix because we now have a lot of his on the record, certainly not sworn under oath, but a lot of on the record discussion about the fact that they knew a lot of the problems with this law going in, and it was purposely withheld from the people.
Well, that's right. Gruber, very faint, before his most recent comments about people being too stupid to understand, made comments on the record that the very reason it was structured this way was to make sure that the states were under pressure to create exchanges.
Exactly.
And so if they didn't create an exchange and their citizens had to go to the federal exchange, they wouldn't get the subsidy.
Right.
That's how it was set up deliberately. Whether the Supreme Court will consider his comments or not, I think remains to be seen, but it's certainly out there.
Scott in Alexandria, since you are raising the Supreme Court, we'll put you up first. You're on with me, Larry O'Connor, and Professor William Jacobson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 2 questions, really. One is during the Bush election, the Supreme Court was addressed for emergency relief. And I was wondering why Congress doesn't use the same action to request emergency relief from the Supreme Court over certain issues that the president is taking by executive order?
Great question, Scott. Now he brings back, of course, the hanging Chad election and emergency relief. Was that because it was motivated from a state?
Well, I think what motivated them is that it was a presidential election and that the court had to get involved quickly. I don't see the court getting involved in an emergency basis on the immigration issue because it's not like the presidential election, which was hanging in the balance.
But couldn't they say, listen, if this moves forward, if we litigate this and in the meantime people are granted a legal status and then suddenly the courts decide that they shouldn't have that status, how do you put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, that's, I think, Obama's strategy is once you've legalized 5 million people, like any entitlement, try taking it away from them.
Right.
And so I think the court could take this case on an expedited basis here at this term, but it's not going to take it on an emergency basis and resolve it in 2 weeks.
I'm curious, when you look at Congress, when you look at the House and the Senate, who do you listen to? Who do you look to as maybe somebody that you have some hope for there in terms of leadership? I know you don't want to get into electoral politics, but on issues like this.
Well, I think Ted Cruz has been very outspoken and very good. He catches a lot of flack from both sides for that, but I think he really understands the issues. I think he's one of the people who understands it.
He's rarely wrong, isn't he? A lot of people, they argue whether he makes the best strategic or political decisions, but on the issue itself, he is very rarely wrong.
That's right, and I think that Jeff Sessions has also been very good as well.
Let's go to Chad in Ashburn. You're next up on WMAL. Hello, Chad.
Hey, Larry. Another aspect I wanted to bring up is not only is the president writing his own laws, but he's approving his own spending. He's taking money that Congress allegedly allocated for one purpose.
Right. And shuffles it along within the budget. We're running out of time, but what about that in the power of the purse?
Well, the power of the purse is the true power Congress has, but there seems to be no willingness on behalf of Republicans to go through what happened a year ago, October, with a seeming shutdown of the government, even though it was only partial.
Well, because that was such a political nightmare for the Republicans. I mean, look, they only won 9 seats.
But there's no
10 months later.
There's no stomach for it.
All right. He's Professor William Jacobson of LegalInsurrection.com. It's at this point where I would plug your book, Professor, but you haven't written it yet. Would you do me a favor and do that?
I'm going to do that.
All right. There you go. We got a commitment from him. It's 5:54.